In just a few short months, the world has become a very different place. COVID-19 has brought nations to a standstill and plunged the global economy into what may be the worst recession since the Second World War. Grabbing the world's attention in January 2020, the virus rapidly took hold across the globe. By March, we were in the grip of a worldwide pandemic, the likes of which had not been seen for 100 years. Border closures and travel restrictions have brought the worldwide aviation industry to its knees.
Attention all passengers. Due to the coronavirus outbreak, passengers are requested not to stand close to each other and not to gather in groups.
As aircraft sit idle on quiet tarmacs and the world's once bustling airports fall silent, world travel has shrunk by over 80%, with worldwide aviation industry losses estimated by IATA in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Australian domestic and international aviation has suffered a catastrophic downturn, with aircraft sidelined, staff stood down, and airports turned into ghost towns. It's time to take a look at how the aviation industry will rebuild and restart, and to examine the turbulence and the opportunities that may well lie ahead.
Wow, that video certainly sets the scene for today's discussion. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world today. I'm Greg Fordham, and thank you for joining us for the AMDA Online Aviation Summit. We're looking forward to an interesting hour of discussion on the state of the aviation industry and the road forward as we move towards a new normal. But before we begin, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panellists. Firstly, someone who needs no introduction, Sir Rod Eddington, having been the CEO for 3 major international airlines around the globe. Lyle Stramby, the CEO of Melbourne Airport, and Malcolm Sharp, the Managing Director of Sharp Airlines. And later in the session, we'll be crossing to Canberra to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Michael McCormack. So, welcome Sir Rod, Lyle and Malcolm.
Thanks, Greg.
But just before we start, a reminder to all of you out in the audience, you can send in questions using the icon located at the lower bottom right corner of your screen. We'd love to hear some interesting questions to challenge our panel. So now to the first of our major questions that we're discussing today. How much? With global shutdown in air transport, many of our regions have seen reductions of far greater than 95%. This has resulted in staggering aviation figures that we've all read and seen, including massive financial losses and job cuts. Lyle, I'm sure you've got some comments on that.
Yes, Greg. The impact has been absolutely enormous across the industry, largely driven by the government's reaction to trying to control the spread of the virus and, of course, not see our healthcare system overwhelmed. At the moment, that's the impact that we're seeing, and it is huge. It's been interesting the way it's evolved quite progressively, starting with international restrictions, then flowing into the domestic market with local border closures. At Melbourne Airport, we saw our traffic initially fall by 98%. Then, of course, the second wave broke out in Victoria, and that number went to 99%, and in fact, even less than 1% of normal traffic now. That's had a huge impact on jobs, as you would expect. At the airport, normally about 20,000 people come to work at the airport each day. At the moment, I think we'd be lucky to see 1,000 people, which is just staggering. And then from an economic impact, yet to really understand it fully. But the BCA, the Business Council of Australia, put out some numbers recently off some research they did. And they were calling the economic impact of both the domestic and international restrictions to Australia to be in the order of $320 million per day. So it is enormous, Greg.
Malcolm, from your perspective, the impact?
Greg, it's been a varied impact on the regional aviation industry. I'd certainly agree with those estimates that we've seen 95%. In some cases where it's interstate travel for regional, it's been 100% reduction. Anyone who's got any exposure to tourism is certainly tourism operators, as far as aviation goes, certainly been affected greatly. There is some good parts to that, though. Obviously, charter and the latest statistics is up, and FIFO, fly-in, fly-out operations is remaining very strong. And for a lot of our businesses, we're leaning back on that FIFO work to carry us forward. So it's been a multifaceted, if you like, a varied approach, but we're seeing some positivity there.
So if we look ahead, obviously we're going to hit with a whole lot of measures that are going to load even more costs onto our industry. What will the impact be, both in the short and longer term, on things like airfares? Rod, what's your view on that?
So costs will go up on the ground and in the air, Greg, and the airlines are under enormous pressure, so they'll be trying to get back to cash flow positive as quickly as they can. We all know it's going to take some time. So there's some real tensions here between charging more and encouraging people to fly to get back in the air, and the airlines are going to have to try and strike a balance. The good news is that the airlines have got sophisticated revenue management systems, so I think we'll get a sense of what it means for airfares when we see how much more capacity is back in the air, because once you commit to capacity, you then try and manage it to optimise revenue. But costs have gone up on the ground and in the air.
And Malcolm, as an airline, what's going to happen to airline profitability?
Well, look, as you would know, in the airline industry, it's very much a user pays. And I totally agree with Rod that, there's going to be increased costs. We've had reports at some regional airports where the cost of security has gone from $5 to $56 per passenger. So obviously the regional industry can't recover if we're going to have to try and pay those costs. And we're not blaming the airports for that, because they've got those costs as well, and they're only simply passing on their costs. So I think it's going to take a major rethink by the government as to how we manage that challenge moving forward.
So Lyle, you've heard the airline's view and the problems against them. You'll go easy on them with airport charges, won't you? Come on.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Look, I can take his sob story and double it, actually. You asked short-term and long-term, so let me talk short-term first. It is absolutely a fact that 90 to 95% of our charges are based on a per-passenger charge. So you have no passengers, you have no revenue. So in our case, our revenues have fallen by 99% at the moment. So the charges to airlines have fallen, and that's the short-term impact. It's not sustainable forever, but that's just a fact of life. But as passengers start to rebuild, I think Sir Rod indicated this, after 9/11, if you think about what happened then with the new security requirements, there are new costs that potentially are going to come into the industry, and they ultimately have to be passed on to the customer. So that's going to be one factor in the long term. And I think just this time frame it's going to take to get passenger numbers back to a scale economy may take a little while, and that will be very challenging then to work out at what point in time can we actually start to recover fully. So it's going to be an interesting road forward from here. So Sir Rod, airport investors prior to the pandemic enjoyed some pretty good times. How's their rate of return going to be hit post-pandemic?
Well, the airlines have taken a huge hit, Greg, and the airports have taken a huge hit too. Airlines have come and gone over the decades, as we all know. But the airport business is always regarded as a much more stable business. Airlines may have come and gone, but passenger throughput has grown steadily over a long period of time. The pandemic's changed all of that. So I think it will change investors' view about investments across the industry, including airports. And that will have implications for the airport's ability to raise the capital they need, because we need them to continue to invest, whether it's in new gates, new runways, new facilities to cope with COVID as an example. So we're going to have to fund airport development as we always have done, but I think investors will take a rather different view about the risks associated with investing in airports.
Do you reckon there'll be any bargains out there for airport investors as a consequence?
Well, there are always bargains, Greg. The question is to recognise them ahead of time, not after the event.
But not all sectors of our industry have been hit really badly. Malcolm, I suspect you might have maybe a good news story or two. And I'm not talking about Richmond winning the premiership on the weekend.
Yeah, well, we won't mention Melbourne Football Club either then, Greg. No, certainly. Look, we've been, most regional aviation businesses have absolutely been pillaged over the last, probably 10, 15 years as far as our skills-based. So, we've lost a large number of pilots. There's a small airline up in Hong Kong that pillaged 60% of our pilots in 2 years, and I'm sure Rod's probably heard of them. And we had to ring them up and complain, and they said, oh, we really like watching your water, but we had to tell them that the tank's dry. So what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a lot of skilled people. Unfortunately, we're losing some people in the industry, and I totally get that, and we should respect that. People have probably had enough, but we're actually seeing some really skilled people coming back down into the industry, and just in our small business, we've got people coming back down from the Qantas Group, from Virgin and from Tiger. So it's quite refreshing to not have that throughput, and for once not to be a training airline for the majors. So that's if you like a silver lining for the regional sector.
And that's prompted actually one question from our audience today. Roughly what percentage of aviation industry employees do you expect will be in a position to rejoin the industry once recovery commences? It's from the Honourable Martin Dixon. Do you want to follow on with that, Malcolm?
Oh, look, I still think there's a long-term opportunity in the aviation business. The predictions of the amount of pilots that are going to be needed in the next 10 years, the industry will recover, and people will probably take an alternative career for a few years. There'll be probably a large number of retirements come forward. There's still, I still think there's quite a lot of opportunity for skilled people in the industry.
So moving on to the second major question of how long. We've seen a range of predictions of when the industry will return to pre-pandemic levels. But as time passes, naturally, it appears those predictions are trending further and further out, perhaps because of uncertainty. Have you got a view on the timing of the recovery, Malcolm?
Look, Greg, we're actually already seeing some recovery in the regional sector. It's pretty much a grassroots recovery. You've got to understand, regional aviation is growing out of a lot of small family enterprises, but their businesses have been around for 20, 30, 40 plus years. And we're seeing some recovery there already. Regional aviation is also, it's a needs-based travel. So people have to travel, whether it be from remote regional communities, they need to travel to bigger centres for health, education. And of course, we're flying the people into those towns that might be fixing the Telstra Tower or building the new hospital. Or in fact, in our operation into remote islands of Bass Strait, we're flying the daily milk and bread into the islands. So, there is certainly, we're seeing recovery. I think it'll be, there's quite a slingshot there at the moment. And I've been speaking to a number of operators around Australia, and they're certainly interstate is still very depressed. But intrastate travel is still quite buoyant. We're seeing numbers get back to between 60 and 90% of pre-COVID levels. So, we see that as quite encouraging. If you look at it from a financial market point of view, and if you look at the share price of Alliance Airlines and look at the share price of Rex, they're actually higher than pre-COVID. So that's an indication that the market actually supports that as well.
So from what you said before, Lyle, 60 to 90% is a real dream for you, but your prediction?
Yeah, look, Greg, it's an easy question to ask. It's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many moving parts actually that you have to contemplate here. I mean, firstly, we've got to get started, and even that's a bit of a dream at the moment. Then I think in the next step will be really predicting the shape of the bounce back, and it will be different in different markets. I mean, as Malcolm just said, then regional markets are likely to go quite quickly because it's considered a safe destination and people are very focused on it. Domestic will rebound pretty well, I suspect, and I think that will be a lot of international, former outbound international travellers actually switching their interest into the Australian destinations. But it's going to be really dictated in the domestic scene by the passenger demand and the airlines' capacity decisions. And I think there's another factor here too, that do we face a third, fourth wave, that sort of thing, which could also upset the pace of recovery. And then ultimately it comes down to bigger picture things about what are we going to recover to ultimately? Is this global pandemic going to have such an impact on economies around the globe that it's going to take a long time to recover back to what we would call normality? And the other one is just passenger changes. People will learn new behaviours and new traits through this. Different markets, but also different behaviours. So travel may or may not feature in those behaviours going forward. So really tough to predict. But domestic should rebound pretty strongly. Regionals, as Malcolm said, will rebound quite quick. And then international sometime thereafter. But we're looking quite a few years yet for a decent recovery back to the 2019 levels.
You touched on, new flares and that impact. But I want to go to aviation and its risk-based model. Like IATA in a recent report said that in 2020 there's only been 40 cases of COVID-19 transmitted on board an aircraft. But in that same time, something like 1.2 million passengers have still flown. So doing the numbers just based on those simple ones, the chances of catching COVID on an aircraft is 1 in 27 million. I'm sure I've got a far greater chance of getting hit by lightning. But then aviation, in every aspect of aviation, has always operated on a risk management model. Yet in some states in Australia, we're working on zero risk at the moment. Can the aviation model be used to influence some more risk-based modelling? So Rod, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, risk management's the key here, Greg, and I think the industry's always had a very good record on that front. It's never been safer to fly than in the run-up to COVID-19. And the industry, whether it's the aircraft manufacturers, the airlines or the airports, are working really hard to ensure that as customers do come back and start flying again, they can be entirely comfortable, not only on board the aeroplane, but on the airports at both ends, because the airport experience is a critical part of this as well. So I think the industry can stand on its track record as an industry that is addressed in an intelligent and capable way risk management. We are doing that again. What we need is governments to recognise that and, as Lyle has said, to start to remove some of the restrictions, in particular in Australia, the hard border closures. We need those borders to open. It is safe to travel. People should be able to travel. We won't see international travel into and out in Australia to any significant degree until there's free travel within Australia. So we've got to start relaxing the border closures here in this country.
Malcolm, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, look, totally agree. I mean, I probably wish that someone had given perhaps the state governments a bit of 101 on risk management. In aviation and, we're a regional airlines, we have a lot of new people coming to our business, but I sit down our pilots and people and explain to them about risk management. If we want to eliminate risk in our business, it would mean we just leave every aircraft sitting on the ground, and that would be the easiest way to eliminate risk. We're very good at doing risk in aviation. I mean, frankly, we're putting 200 or 300 people into a metal tube and pushing them through the air at 500 miles an hour. So, we do understand risk, and there has to be some residual risk. if you don't allow them to be some small amount of residual risk, and we use the term as low as reasonably practical in aviation, then you'll never get business started again. And I think that's what we'd like to see the governments recognise, that they do need to take some risk to get the economy moving.
So as you point out, like globally in Australia, we've got one of the lowest rates of community transmission of COVID, but some of the strictest conditions on the movement of people. However, you know, just this week, we're all looking forward to and hoping that by Christmas, that we're able to open up the state borders. So what will be the rebound of domestic aviation when that happens? So firstly to you, Lyle, will the Qantas Group, through Qantas Mainline and Jetstar, dominate even more than they did pre the pandemic?
Good question again. Look, there's an old saying that in adverse times, the strong get stronger. So there's certainly an opportunity for that here. I do reflect back to what happened post 9/11 when Ansett collapsed. Qantas took that opportunity to expand its market share quite considerably at that point in time and did very well out of that. And you'd have to say the conditions for that are quite good at the moment. So for an organisation like Qantas, there are some wonderful opportunities in adversity. You think about those conditions at the moment, they're up against a competitor who is just recovering from voluntary administration. So, you know, it will recover a leaner and sharper airline, but may not be in a position to snatch the market that might be there. Qantas also has some real capability, because not only have they got their domestic fleet, but they've got a very big grounded international fleet that they could repoint onto the domestic market. And they could use that quite effectively to grab the market. But it will probably come down to Qantas's ambitions or strategies, playing off short-term versus long-term gains. So if they were playing a short-term game, they'd be recovering their balance sheet, get their cash flows going, and maybe not so keen on growth. If playing a long-term game, though, they might actually go after a bit of growth. So it's going to be interesting to watch that dynamic play out in real life.
And you mentioned Virgin and, well, Virgin Mark II. So Rod, what do you think the operating model will be for the new Virgin and its chances of survival?
They've obviously thought long and hard about it, Greg, and I think they've decided correctly, I believe, to relaunch Virgin as an entity that's in many ways more like Virgin Blue than the current full-service Virgin airline that went into administration, trying to find a spot between the two where they've got a competitive cost base and they can offer value-for-money fares, and in doing so find a way to carve out a piece of the market where they can operate profitably. It'll be a smaller airline, fewer aeroplanes, fewer aeroplane types, probably an all 737 fleet. Simplicity is a real virtue in this business, so they have some opportunities here, but we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to relaunch at a time like this, when you're effectively going to be a domestic airline and the border closures means the domestic market is still at best in a holding pattern. So there's some hard work to be done. They should be able to do it, but there have never been any guarantees in the airline business.
So could we expect them to look a bit like a Southwest in the US?
I think if you take the US comparator, an American airline's a full-service carrier, Southwest a low-cost carrier. You've got airlines like JetBlue, which are somewhere in the middle, sometimes called hybrid airlines. So, as it were, they offer a bit more than the complete no-frills model, but not nearly as much as the full-service model. I think they'll try and find a spot in there where they can operate and operate profitably. Perhaps more like JetBlue than Southwest, but it's going to be something that the management and board of Virgin will need to think very carefully about.
Then the other one I've got to ask you, the impact of Rex moving into trunk routes.
Yes, I think Rex have taken the opportunity. There are plenty of 737s around at the moment and men and women to fly them. So they've decided that they're going to get onto the key trunk routes, which means you'll have three carriers, at least the Qantas family, the new Virgin and Rex. That'll put enormous competitive pressure onto those trunk routes. Those trunk routes have historically only supported two operators. We can go back to Compass Mark I and Compass Mark II, who tried to get into those markets. Rex have probably got a good chance given the availability of equipment and people right now, but whether or not those trunk routes can ultimately sustain 3 independent operators remains to be seen.
Then to you, Malcolm, opening up the borders, the impact on regional communities?
Well, look, the impact on regional communities, Greg, could have been quite dramatic. As I said before, it's a needs-based travel. So we're talking about health, education, talking about daily staples. Even in the Bass Strait Islands, if you're doing your senior years at college, you have to hop on an aircraft to go to school. So you know, it could have been catastrophic for the regional industry. Of course, we've been very lucky that or it's through good management that we've had the state and federal governments come in behind and support the regional aviation industry through the RANs. That's the Regional Aviation Network subsidies, and that's certainly helped. And at least a lot of these places now, a lot of these remote regional communities have at least 2 services a week, which is certainly meeting that demand. So we've obviously got a way to go. It's not all beer and skittles. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of communities that still need more services. So we'll be looking forward to working with particularly the federal and state governments to continue that support as we come through the recovery from COVID.
Another question from the audience that's relevant to route development and everything. In Australia, we are already seeing innovative city pairings. Is this likely to extend to the Trans-Tasman, for example, at Hobart to New Zealand service? Sir Rod?
I think smaller, fuel-efficient modern aeroplanes lend themselves to point-to-point. The Tasmanian market is not very big. There have been services between Hobart and New Zealand before, and clearly the Taswegians would love to see more of that. There will be some new city pairs, particularly as some of the narrow-bodied, longer-range aeroplanes, the A321 long-range aeroplane can do things that narrow bodies haven't been able to do in the past. So there will be opportunities for more point-to-point travel. I think that was a coming trend anyway. And I think people will open their minds to this, but my sense is the first priority will be to re-establish the network on the trunk routes, Greg, because that's the bread and butter of airline profitability.
But then eventually we will see international borders open up, obviously country by country. But is Australia at risk because we're basically at the end of the line for a lot of services and airlines? I suspect airlines might focus more on shorter haul international before they go long haul. And of course, international schedules are governed by the 6-monthly scheduling seasons. So if a service doesn't get in 6 months, we've got to wait 6 months before someone's going to turn up at your airport, Lyle. Rod, are we going to miss out because of our geographical and other factors?
We've got to be careful not to, Greg. It would be my take on that as the people who do the network planning for the major airlines that serve Australia, we've got to make sure that Australia is very much on their radar. Australia's always been a popular destination. You only need to go to one of our airports in normal times and look at all the airlines, overseas airlines that fly to Australia to realise that, particularly within this region. And I'm sure they'll continue to view Australia as an important long-term market. However, if the domestic borders don't come down, then I think it's unrealistic to expect that foreign carriers will have much enthusiasm to fly here. They'll take the view that if governments aren't prepared to allow people to travel internally, then overseas travel will be difficult. For instance, Australia is the only country I know of where you need a permit to leave the country. Of course, you need to go into quarantine for reasons we all understand, 2 weeks quarantine when you come back into Australia, but you also need a permit to leave the country. And I think that would mean that foreign carriers would look long and hard at their Australian services. And I think we'll see, if those restrictions stay in place, a diminishing of the number of international services rather than an increase.
So assuming we get our act together with all of that, Then on the flip side, Lyle, do you see an increased opportunity as Australia is regarded as a very safe place, even more so than it was pre-pandemic?
Yes, I do. I mean, and while I agree with what Sir Rod just said then, I think in the short, medium term, though, all those factors are absolutely true. If you cast your mind a little bit further down the path than that, and you think about a time where there is a vaccine or we get away from this 14-day quarantine, then I think Australia is really uniquely positioned, because as much as the COVID experience in Australia has been brutal, at this stage really it's been largely driven by government actions to lock borders and the like. If you were sitting anywhere outside of Australia, and we obviously talk to a lot of people in our networks, Australia is still incredibly well regarded, and I think if anything our stocks as a fantastic destination, certainly for inbound tourism, will have only strengthened as a result of our endeavour and success really around COVID compared to other nations. Because again, you know, yes, our infection rates have been pretty amazingly low. We have had some unfortunate deaths, but our infection rates are not even matching some countries' death rates. So if you're sitting outside looking at Australia and then thinking about the broader appeal of the market anyway and the nation, it's got to look a pretty good opportunity. And I do reflect back to a time too when Japan was the hot market to Australia. And at that point, we had 4% of the Japanese market, and it was enormous. The impact that had on Australia was phenomenal, the revenues that drove through all segments of tourism. Well, we've only ever had 1% of the Chinese market, a really big market, not too far from here, same sort of time zone, and they do like the product that we have to offer. And now they would look into Australia and say, I've got Europe, I've got America, but I've got Australia on my doorstep. Which one do I think I might go to? And I think there's a huge opportunity in that for us.
So Malcolm, if Lyle's right, will that flow through to regional?
Oh, absolutely, and we're seeing evidence of that now. I spoke to two well-established outback tour companies only this week, and you know, they've had their whole 2020 wiped out, so they've deferred obviously their customers into 2021, and then they took the gamble to double that again and to put in their schedule for 2021 as it would have been. So basically, they've doubled their schedule for 2021. And both of those companies reported that they've actually just about sold out for 2021. So that's certainly a good news story. There's quite a lot of opportunity with regional airlines. There's some acquisitions out there to bring a few of the businesses together. And I think if you think back to 9/11 and we saw what came out of 9/11, and I mentioned earlier about, if you like, the pin-up boys of regional aviation being Alliance Airlines and Regional Express. If we go back to and look at history, Alliance Airlines was formed because they acquired the assets of Flight West Airlines, and that's become a very, very good business now. 41 aircraft, just announced that purchasing 14 Embraer 190s, flying to 46 destinations. Regional Express, founded in 2002 with the merger of two great regional airlines in Australia, being Hazelton and obviously Kendall Airlines, and two names that are synonymous with regional aviation in Australia. They formed out of 9/11 as well. They've now got 57 aircraft, and now they're buying 737s, or at least leasing 737s. So, look, we've got to be positive. We've got to look forward, and there are some opportunities. So there may be another alliance, or there may be another Rex that comes out of this type of restructure.
Sticking with the international, because we do have a question from the audience. As a result of COVID, will the previous yellow vaccination passport folder re-emerge as a digital health visa? Anyone like to respond to that?
I might give that one a go. Look, I think it is likely. If we get to a vaccine and that becomes the pathway to international travel without having to do 14-day quarantine, I think that will be very desirable for people. And I think with the automation that we have these days and what we've proven through COVID as well, the use of automation, there's some very easy pathways to fix that and actually track those digital records. It will come down to the confidence the receiving country has in that data being entered in the first place, but I can't see a reason why that's not possible and very doable and actually relatively quickly.
Just before we move to the final major question of today, will it survive the turbulence? We're going to cross to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Michael McCormack in Canberra.
Good afternoon and thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you. We are living through a pandemic which is hitting the aviation industry very hard. It hit the aviation industry first, it hit it extremely hard. But I am proud of the quick action our government took to build a safety net so people and goods can keep flying during COVID-19, albeit at a much reduced level. We're providing leased federal airports partial relief from land tax charges until the end of the year. We've waived Air Services Australia charges and are rebating domestic aviation security charges and fuel excise for eligible operators. And it's made a real difference. We're also underwriting a minimum network of domestic and regional services, more than 400 return flights per week to more than 120 locations. Locations which, but for the assistance, may not have seen a plane right the way through. We're keeping international supply chains open for high-value, perishable and time-sensitive products to overseas markets, as well as for critical health items into Australia. Personal protection equipment, face masks, respiratory devices and the like. All up, the Morrison-McCormack government has committed more than $2.7 billion to support the aviation sector during COVID-19. It is a global pandemic. We are addressing the issues, of course. I'm also confident that underlying consumer demand for aviation remains strong, as are the prospects for rebuilding market activity over time. In the short term, COVID-safe flying is a consumer concern. Industry has worked closely with Commonwealth agencies to develop a protocol for domestic travel, providing guidance on issues such as the use of face masks and hygiene and cleaning. We have worked with airlines to establish the most efficient approach to mandatory contact tracing for passengers. That is so important. We also need our domestic borders to open more widely and sooner. We're also contributing funding to Tourism Australia's domestic marketing campaigns. This is critical. We need people to be travelling again, and of course they're going to be holidaying at home this year, so it's critical that they are able to do so. We're looking to reopen international borders for passengers where we can do so safely. In the first instance, we are building a safe travel zone with New Zealand, a trans-Tasman bubble. Kiwis can now travel to Australia quarantine-free. Of course, we're also actively monitoring current trials for a COVID-19 vaccine. But we should be planning now for a post-pandemic recovery. And indeed, we're doing just that. Next year, the government will release a 5-year plan for aviation outlining the policies and reforms needed to support the sector through the challenging recovery period and beyond. I want, and you need this plan, to focus on reducing the regulatory burden, supporting greater local decision-making and better targeted assistance to ensure that the aviation industry is equipped for success in the post-pandemic world. However, we do need your input. We value your input. You still have a fortnight to make submissions to this vital process. So please look for the Future of Australia's Aviation Sector issues paper and please contribute. I am very optimistic about the future of commercial aviation in Australia. For all those employed in the industry and for those whose own livelihoods depend on it, I look forward to a very bright future with your help. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you'll agree that that was a positive message and a good lead into our final major question. Will it survive the turbulence? I was pleased that the Deputy Prime Minister didn't use the term unprecedented because I think it's been overutilised. It implies there are no precedents. However, I clearly remember catching a train from Melbourne to Kalgoorlie to attend a meeting at Kalgoorlie Airport when the entire Australian domestic fleet was grounded during the pilots' dispute. I also remember being on a flight in North America when the captain came on and said, "We've been instructed to land at the closest airport because there's been a security incident in New York," and that was September 11. So I found myself ended up in a wonderful motel in Winnipeg in the middle of Canada where I spent a few days. Couldn't have been further away from Melbourne on this globe. And whilst I was there, I heard that Ansett Australia had stopped flying, gone into administration, and lo and behold, I was flying on a ticket issued by Ansett Australia. So I felt pretty lonely over there. But then returning home through Los Angeles Airport, I remember walking outside and eerily there was no noise, no cars and no people. And even during this pandemic, Los Angeles hasn't been that quiet. So yes, there has been precedence. But I suspect the three of you have all made some pretty tough decisions during previous tough times that has then resulted in some positive outcomes. So perhaps you could share that with us. Lyle, do you want to go first?
Greg, I think you're right. I mean, the industry's had plenty of warm-ups over the many years. And for me, probably the biggest and the best warm-up was 9/11, where I was running an airline in the UK against this guy, actually, in competition with this guy right on my right-hand side here. And 9/11 was a real challenging time to get through, but it was a little bit different in its construct. And I use an analogy just to try and describe what it felt like being a senior executive in aviation at that time. And it was a little bit like walking up to a cliff edge, and you're just walking up to have a look at the view. Somebody has slipped a bungee rope around your leg, unbeknownst to you, and then pushed you off the cliff. And you find yourself falling, and you look back through 9/11 thinking, gee, I think the rope might be a little bit long. And so our airline, and I'm sure many airlines at that time, had to tie knots in that rope as fast as possible. The thing that was interesting, though, was we were able to do that in our business and many airlines. And we knew there was going to be a fairly good rebound and relatively quickly. And in that case, I think traffic volumes on the transatlantic fell by about 25% at the time. And we were back in really good shape within a year. Now, this time, it feels very different. And we're still learning about what it's actually going to be for us. It is a little akin, again, to walking up to that cliff, being pushed off and looking up and not seeing a rope attached to your leg. And so, you know, we've had to all do a number of different things. The first one was to respond to what was actually happening to us at the time and making sure we stayed safe. Second one was really building our resilience as a business so that we can actually get through a really challenging period where we're not sure where this is going to end. And that's made it really hard this time. And then, of course, we want to be preparing for the rebound. And the longer this goes on, the more likely things are going to be different going forward. So trying to project forward and see what that future might look like so you're positioning your business in the best possible shape to succeed. So my analogy sort of ends with, we've got to learn how to fly again because there's no rope attached to our leg. And those who do it well, I think will come out of this in great shape. Not all will.
You touched on it before, but passenger confidence, is that going to affect the rebound though?
I think passenger confidence is really important, and I think it will be very different in different market segments. And so there's not one size fits all here. I mean, our early market research is telling us passengers have not lost their quest for flying at all, their thirst for flying. Although a lot of our international flying outbound from Australia was driven by the baby boomer generation, who happen to be quite susceptible in a COVID world. So they might rethink the destinations that they're prepared to fly to. They might also have had some pretty bad experiences through COVID because a lot of people got stranded and had trouble getting refunds. So they might rethink. But again, regional is likely to be highly confident. Domestically, as soon as we open up our borders, our research is telling us people are ready and queued up to fly. So I think there'll be quite an explosion. So different in different markets, though, is probably the right answer, Greg.
So Rod, tough decision from the past?
I think we've had all of them. If you're in the industry for any length of time, you have to confront the realities. I mean, one of the interesting things for me will be what this means for fleet. Lyle's touched very sensibly on what it means for markets and consumer confidence, but I think one of the things airlines will be thinking about is, I look at my fleet, can I simplify it? What aeroplanes do I want in my fleet in the new COVID normal? And all of us have had to think through the issue of retirement. In my time at British Airways, we had to confront the retirement of Concorde, a wonderful aeroplane which we all love dearly. But for a whole series of reasons, its time was up in 2003 and we had to retire it. I think the 747, which has been for 50 years the queen of the skies, airlines by and large are retiring their 747 fleets. It's a big four-engine aeroplane. And a much newer variant, the A380. I think a lot of airlines are grounding their A380 fleets. And some of those aeroplanes, many of those aeroplanes probably won't fly again as the focus will be on smaller, more fuel-efficient twin-engine aeroplanes. So I think as you look at what this means for your airline, you'll start off by thinking about your network and your fleet, and that's got implications for crews, for ground staff, for maintenance. It's got implications for airports. This is going to require a substantial degree of reflection on what a profitable airline is going to look like on the other side. As Lyle's intimated, they're not all going to get it right. Those that do will reap the benefits.
So a casualty of COVID could be the early retirement of the global A380 fleet?
Well, the A380 has been a terrific aeroplane for customers. I love flying on it. It's a very big aeroplane, 4 engines, very heavy. It needs a lot of people who want to go to the same place at the same time to make any money. Many airlines have relatively small 380 fleets. So I think the focus will be on the 787, the A350, the 330neo, the 777X, the new twin-engined aeroplanes, fuel-efficient, newer engines. So the A380, which first flew about 15 years ago, has been a terrific addition to global fleets, although they've only made about 250. The last one we know is currently on the production line, so Airbus have said they're not going to produce any more after next year, 2021. So I think it's one of the questions that the airlines who operate that aeroplane type will be asking itself, just as they'll be asking themselves whether or not the 747-400 has a role as a passenger aeroplane beyond this. Clearly there will be a lot of 747 freighters flying for a very long time. So this is the sort of catastrophic time in the industry when airlines will have to rethink fleet as well as people.
And Malcolm, in regional aviation, you would have made plenty of tough decisions.
Oh, look, Greg, yeah, resilience is something we spread on our toast every morning and eat it. And look, that's the same in all of aviation. We're a very tough bunch. We've been through a lot of challenges in our time. If I think back and when the COVID first came, I actually wrote a letter to all our staff just to make them feel a little bit better about what we're doing. And I started to list the crises we've been through in our 30 years as a business. And it was quite amazing. I sort of got down the page a bit and thought I better stop this because I'll make people leave the business. But, you know, we've certainly had challenges, and I'll just mention a couple. But early on, like most regional operators, we started off with a piston fleet. In 1999-2000, due to fuel contamination, we had the grounding of the piston fleet in southeast Australia. That took 3 to 6 months to recover. Around 2000, there was a number of issues around engine crankshafts, and which saw a lot of our fleets again grounded. And that issue took quite a long time to resolve. And I remember as an airline owner that I was sitting in my office having made payroll that week, and that's something that we normally celebrate over a beer, and thinking about how I'm going to make payroll next week. And I had to write a letter to the head of Textron Lycoming, a multi-billion-dollar company in America, and I just laid it on the line. The following Monday, I received a FedEx letter in the mail with a cheque, and that made us make payroll that week. So, I mean, we've certainly had, and I'm not talking about myself either. I know a lot of people in regional aviation, and you know, it is a tough game, but we're resilient like the regional remote communities that we service. You know, we've been here for the long haul for them. Just to finish off on that, of course, then in 2001, we decided in our own right we'd get an airline licence just before 9/11. And another great decision. And of course, we know what happened in September of 2001, which unfortunately then saw a cascading effect for regional aviation, as a lot of the regional aviation businesses lost their interline agreements they had with Ansett. And obviously, they turned up to work when Ansett collapsed with 0 bookings. So, you know, we have been through this before. We're a resilient bunch of people from the top down to the bottom of this industry, and we'll certainly get through it again.
But in this industry, timing is everything, eh? And you can never pick it. I noticed the Deputy PM, in his words, referred to reforms. Firstly to you, Malcolm. Let's not waste a crisis. What reforms can we get out of this crisis?
Look, I touched on it before, Greg. One of the major reforms we'd like to see is to try and find another model than to use a PAYS, particularly in the interim. I mean, all due respect to Lyle sitting here, and he's got to obviously get a return to his shareholders. We can't go straight away back into a user pays scenario because it's going to stifle travel for all of us, and that affects both the airports and the airlines. The other thing that we can do too is that the Civil Aviation Safety Authority is pushing ahead with a whole range of regulatory reforms in the next 12 months. This has obviously been going on, as people would know in the industry, for a number of years. Last year in July, the CASA put out a directive, and I'll have to read it out because it's a fairly long directive, but it's the development application of a risk-based and cost-effective aviation safety regulation. So I think what I would like to see is perhaps our regulator, obviously driven by the department, go and actually have a look at this next suite of regulations that are coming out, go back to first principles on cost-effective safety and just make sure that, of course, we're always aiming for absolute safety in aviation, but just make sure that the industry can afford the next 12 months of regulatory change. If it can't, then let's just kick it down a road for another year.
Like, I myself started off back in April thinking a crisis, let's get some reforms. We wrote a paper on what we thought was very logical to come out of this to streamline the inbound processing of people from overseas countries. That could be implemented as we opened up country by country. And obviously we were very much using digital technology to do that. We circulated it wide and far through all stakeholders and government and got, I was going to say, I won't use the word zero interest, very little interest. However, just last week, an element of that was announced by the government of a digital arrivals card. So I live in hope. But even that, they said, oh, it won't be ready for 12 months. Well, it's not my area of expertise, but come on, we're in the middle of the crisis. Let's do something. I'm going to throw it on you, Sir Rod. Am I being naive? How can we get governments out of this crisis to do some reforms and work quicker? Am I dreaming?
No, you're not dreaming, but I think the focus is work quicker, because my experience of government is that they will never be as quick as those of us in the private sector would wish them to be. The critical thing is that they ultimately deliver the reform. The good news, Greg, is that you and I can remember when governments decided in traffic right terms who could fly where, how often and when. They decided what the fare should be, what aeroplane types you could operate. And prior to domestic deregulation in America, when the deregulation part of the commercial aviation industry changed, and that spilled over in Australia. We had the two airline policy. Again, governments decided what aeroplane you could fly, where you could fly, when you could fly, what you could serve on board. All of that's long gone. And it took some long and determined pushing by many people for that to happen. So the deregulation that we would all like to see will require those of us in the industry to constantly make the case. And you'll never be quite sure when you actually make a difference. You've just got to keep on making the case. And I think in the area you've discussed, technology is our friend. And there's no reason why governments can't use technology to help a whole series of things happen, including inbound arrivals. So keep going.
Wise words as always. We've got one more question from the audience. Is there any research or developments being initiated by the aircraft manufacturers and the industry directed at onboard health protection?
Yes, there's a lot going on. Aircraft manufacturers, including the seat manufacturers, airlines and airports, because we've got to make the journey from leaving home to arriving at your destination risk low as quickly as possible, and that means we're in this together. And the good news is, in my experience, the industry's got a pretty good reputation for working together in these circumstances. Aircraft manufacturers, airlines and airports. And I think they've already done terrific work. As the IATA figures demonstrate, there's almost no evidence that travelling on an aeroplane exposes you to transmission risk from COVID-19. The numbers are clear. and I think they'll only get better because the key players in this industry will work collectively. I've always taken the view that the only people who can take safety for granted in our industry are our customers. Those of us who are in the industry have to deliver every day to make sure that journey is as safe as possible, and the industry has a really good track record of doing just that, Greg.
So even more so post-pandemic, the riskiest part of the journey will be driving to the mode of transport you choose to get to the airport rather than the air transport journey itself.
It might be walking down your drive to get into the car, Greg. Tripping over the hose.
Well, we're just about out of time. But before we finish, I have one final question to each of you. And I want a short, sharp answer. What is something amusing that you have seen or heard or learnt during the pandemic that has helped you keep your sense of humour? Malcolm, lead off.
Oh, Greg, I don't know if it's actually amusing or it's pretty sad, but I think for me, perhaps one of the defining moments was seeing the US President suggest I was going to say sir then, but Donald Trump stand up and suggest that we should inject ourselves with, obviously, disinfectant. So for me, that was a bit of a turning point when I'm saying, you know, wow, this is getting way out of hand. So.
Lyle?
Oh, Greg, I've loved the creativity I've seen around the globe. You know, as people have been in lockdown and you see all these TikTok clips and YouTube clips, and there's been some absolute classics that I think just give you great heart. And the one that stands out for me is a really tight shot of a young man sitting next to an aircraft window, and you're seeing the beautiful landscape go past the window there, and you're thinking of, you know, this was shot on board an aircraft. And then it pans out, and it turns out this guy's sitting in his laundry on a bunch of clothing. He's sitting next to his drying machine, and of course he's got an iPad inside the dryer with the scenery showing there. And it actually was one of those moments where, one, I had a laugh because I just love the creativity, but number two, it just reminded me how important travel still is to people and how they really long for those days of free and easy travel. And we will get back to that point in the not too distant future.
Brilliant. Sir Rod?
Greg, like all Victorians, I've been locked up for quite some time, and there's a natural tension between eating and drinking too much and seeing the waistline push out and trying to get 10,000 steps a day under your belt so it goes in the opposite direction. And it's been a tug of war that I haven't always won, but I've enjoyed the journey.
It was certainly hard putting on a suit today, I'll have to tell you that.
Indeed, for both of us.
Well, it's time to wrap up. I'd like to thank our terrific panel, Sir Rod Eddington, Lyle Stramby, Malcolm Sharp, and thank you also to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Michael McCormack, for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us today. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to have this discussion with you, Sir Rod, Lyle and Malcolm, and thank you for sharing your invaluable insights in a very interesting discussion. Before we leave you today, just let me take a moment to remind you that Avalon 2021, the International Air Show and Aerospace and Defence Exposition, is on again next year. We really hope you can join us at Avalon from the 23rd to the 28th of November for what promises to be one of the biggest air shows yet as we mark the centenary of the Royal Australian Air Force. And as part of the Industry Days, I hope you'll join me for the Airbiz Conference, which will take place on Wednesday the 24th of November at Avalon. We hope you enjoyed today's Aviation Summit. We do appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we wish you all the very best for whatever the future brings. Look out for the AMDA online events in the coming months, and we hope to see you at Avalon 2021. I'm Greg Fordham. Thank you and goodbye.